This fruit, the most ordinary thing in your kitchen, overthrew governments and buried thousands of people. There is a fruit in your kitchen right now that once had more power than most presidents. It bought armies, it rewrote borders, it owned entire countries, their land, their railroads, their ports, even their newspapers. And when one small nation dared to stand up to it and take back its own soil, this fruit reached across the world, pulled the strings of a superpower, and had that government destroyed. Millions of people would suffer for decades because of it, and the whole time, it was smiling at you from a grocery shelf, wrapped in a bright little sticker. This is the story of the banana, and how the cheapest fruit in the world overthrew governments, crushed the people who grew it, and hid one of the darkest business crimes of the 20th century behind a happy yellow peel. Before the banana became a weapon, it was a curiosity. Picture the United States in the middle of the 19th century. If you wanted a banana, you almost certainly couldn't get one. The fruit didn't grow anywhere near the country. It grew in the hot, wet lowlands of Central America and the Caribbean, thousands of miles away, across seas and jungles, in places most Americans had never heard of. And the banana had a fatal flaw. It rotted. Fast. A banana picked ripe would turn to brown mush long before any ship could carry it north. So for most of history, the banana was a stranger to the Western world. On the rare occasions one made it to a city like New York or Boston, it was treated like a luxury from another planet. People displayed them. They ate them carefully with a knife and fork, unsure of the etiquette, as if handling something precious and slightly dangerous. A single banana could cost more than most families spent on a real meal. It was exotic, expensive, and almost impossible to find. Which raises an obvious question. How did this fragile, rotting oddity, a fruit that couldn't survive a long journey and cost a fortune when it did, become the cheapest thing in the produce aisle? How did it go from a rich man's novelty to a fruit so common we don't even think about it, so cheap we throw the bruised ones away? The answer is not a story about farming. It's a story about power. Because turning the banana into an everyday item required something staggering. It required conquering distance, conquering time, and eventually conquering entire countries. Here's the core of the problem. To sell bananas at scale, you couldn't just grow them. You had to build a machine that stretched across the whole hemisphere. You needed vast plantations carved out of jungle. You needed railroads to haul the fruit to the coast before it spoiled. You needed ports and docks and a fleet of fast steamships with refrigerated holds to race the harvest north before the clock ran out. You needed telegraph lines to coordinate all of it, and warehouses and distribution networks on the other end. No farmer could do that. No ordinary company could do that. It required something new, an organization so large, so vertically integrated that it controlled every single step from the soil to the store. One entity that owned the land, the trains, the ships, the ports, and the sales. Nothing left to chance. Nothing left to anyone else. And in the closing years of the 19th century, exactly such an organization was being assembled. A handful of ambitious men were stitching together plantations, railways, and shipping lines into a single, gigantic enterprise. What they were building would soon become one of the most powerful corporations the world had ever seen. A company that would grow so vast and so ruthless that it would treat sovereign nations as its private property. They were solving the puzzle of the rotting fruit. But in solving it, they were quietly building an empire. One with no king, no borders, and no loyalty to anything but profit. An empire whose currency was the banana. And before I show you what that empire did, the countries it swallowed, the workers it broke, and the government it destroyed with the help of the most powerful nation on earth, do one thing. If you like true stories about the ordinary things that hide extraordinary crimes, subscribe right now. Because this is only one of them, and the ones coming are just as dark. The men building this banana empire had a nickname waiting for their creation. The people who lived under it wouldn't call it a company, they would call it the octopus. The octopus had a real name, United Fruit Company. It was born in 1899, when a few of those ambitious men merged their plantations, railways, and shipping lines into a single giant. On paper, it was just a produce business, a company that grew bananas and sold them. But that description is like calling a battleship a boat. What they had actually created was a private empire, and within a couple of decades, it would stretch its arms into a dozen countries at once. Here is how completely it took over. In the small nations of Central America and the Caribbean, United Fruit didn't just rent some land and hire some pickers. It owned the plantations, enormous ones, carved out of jungle across entire regions. It owned the railroads that ran through those countries because it had built them to move its fruit. If you wanted to ship anything by rail in some of these nations, you paid United Fruit. It owned the ports where the ships docked. It owned the ships themselves, a fleet so large it was nicknamed the Great White Fleet. It owned the telegraph lines, meaning it controlled how information moved. In some places, it even printed the money that workers were paid in. Think about what that means. A single American corporation controlled the land, the transport, the communication, and the money of foreign countries. It could decide who got a job and who starved. It could decide which crops got to market. Its executives could pick up a telephone in Boston and shape the economy of a nation 1,000 miles away that most Americans couldn't find on a map. This is where a phrase was born that we still use today, usually as a joke. Banana Republic. We throw it around now to mean a clothing store or a corrupt little country, but it started here, and it was not a joke. A banana republic was a real thing, a country whose entire economy, and often its government, was owned and operated in the service of the banana trade, a nation that existed, in practice, as a farm for a foreign company. The people who lived under this system understood exactly what it was. They gave United Fruit a nickname that captured the truth far better than its official title. They called it El Pulpo, the octopus. Because everywhere you looked, there was another tentacle, wrapped around the railroad, around the port, around the courthouse, around the president's office. You could not escape it. Whatever you touched in your daily life, the octopus was already holding it. And the octopus did not tolerate rivals. If a local farmer tried to grow bananas independently, he'd find he couldn't get them onto the railroad, or onto a ship, or into a market, because United Fruit controlled all of it. The company bought up far more land than it ever actually planted. That wasn't waste, it was strategy. By owning huge stretches of unused territory, it made sure no competitor could ever get a foothold. Empty land was a weapon. To keep governments friendly, the octopus reached into politics directly. It handed money to the right officials. It backed the right candidates. When a leader proved cooperative, the company thrived and the leader grew rich. When a leader started asking difficult questions about taxes, about wages, about who really owned the country, the company had ways of making that leader's life very short indeed. United Fruit didn't need to win elections. It just needed to own the people who did. For a while, this arrangement looked unshakable. The octopus grew fatter every year. Bananas flooded into American kitchens, cheaper and cheaper, until the once exotic luxury became the most ordinary fruit in the country. And almost nobody eating them had any idea what it took to keep them coming. The whole apparatus of control humming away, out of sight, in countries whose names never made the news. But an empire built on holding people down creates a very specific kind of danger. Push people far enough, take enough from them, pay them little enough, and eventually they stop being afraid. Eventually they organize. Eventually they say no. And when the workers of the octopus finally did say no, the answer they received would be written in blood on a train platform, on a night that an entire country would spend the next 100 years trying not to forget. The platform was at a railway station in a town called Cienega in Colombia, and the night was the 6th of December, 1928. To understand what happened there, you have to understand how the workers lived. The men who grew and cut the bananas, the people whose labor made the whole empire run, were treated as barely human. They worked brutal hours in the heat, hacking down bunches under a punishing sun. They were often not even employed directly, but through middlemen, a legal trick that let the company deny it owed them anything at all. They were paid not in real money, but in company scrip, tokens that could only be spent at company stores, at company prices. They lived in company barracks. They drank company water and got sick from it. If they were injured, no one owed them care. If they died, they were simply replaced. These men had almost nothing. But in the autumn of 1928, they discovered they had one thing left: each other. Tens of thousands of banana workers laid down their tools and went on strike. Their demands were not radical. They wanted written contracts. They wanted to be paid in actual currency instead of tokens. They wanted a 6-day week, medical care, decent sanitation. They wanted, in short, to be treated as people rather than parts of a machine. The company's response was to refuse. Any concession, they believed, would crack the whole system. And so the strike dragged on, and the plantations went quiet, and the fruit sat unpicked. The pressure built. The company leaned on the government, and it leaned hard, framing the strike not as a labor dispute, but as a dangerous uprising, the seeds of revolution that had to be crushed before it spread. The government listened. Troops were sent to the banana zone, and on that December night, thousands of striking workers and their families had gathered in the square by the railway station in Cienega, waiting, hoping for a resolution. They were not an army. They were men and women and children packed into an open space in the dark. The soldiers set up their positions around the square. An officer read out a decree ordering the crowd to disperse within minutes. Then the shooting started. We do not know exactly how many died that night, and that uncertainty is part of the horror. The official numbers given at the time were absurdly low, a handful, the government claimed. But witnesses spoke of something far worse. Bodies loaded onto trains in the dark and carried away, dumped into the sea so they could never be counted. Estimates of the dead range from dozens into the hundreds, and some accounts push far higher. The truth was deliberately buried in every sense of the word. What made it unforgettable was not just the killing. It was who had ordered it, and for whom. A national army had turned its guns on its own citizens, not to defend the country, but to protect the profits of a foreign corporation. The state had become the hired muscle of the fruit company. The octopus had not needed to fire a single shot itself. It had simply pointed, and a government had pulled the trigger. The massacre sent a chill through the region that lasted for generations. The message was unmistakable: organize, resist, ask for the dignity owed to any human being, and this is what waits for you. The company would go on. The fruit would keep flowing north, and the people who died on that platform would become a wound in the memory of a nation, so painful that decades later a great writer would fold it into a novel and make the whole world remember what the official records had tried to erase. But here is the thing about a machine that survives by crushing people. It teaches those people something. It teaches them that asking politely gets you shot. And sooner or later, somewhere else in the empire, someone would come along who refused to ask politely. Someone with real power, elected by his own people, who looked at the octopus and decided that an entire country did not have to belong to a fruit company. His name would become the reason a superpower reached across the world to destroy him. His name was Jacobo Arbenz, and he was not supposed to happen. For decades, Guatemala had been the octopus's favorite kind of country, run by strong men who did as they were told. The fruit company owned enormous swaths of the nation's best land, controlled its main railroad, its main port, its electricity. Ordinary Guatemalans lived in poverty on top of some of the richest soil in the hemisphere, while the profits sailed north. It was the arrangement the company had perfected everywhere: quiet, obedient, and endlessly profitable. Then, in 1950, Guatemala did something dangerous. It held a real election, and its people chose Arbenz, a reformer who had watched his country be treated as a warehouse for someone else's fruit and had decided it would stop. Arbenz looked at the single deepest wound in the nation: land. A tiny elite and a handful of foreign companies owned almost everything worth owning, while the vast majority of Guatemalans had no ground of their own to farm. So, in 1952, he launched a land reform, and the details of that reform matter enormously, because they expose the whole lie of what came next. The law targeted only uncultivated land, fields that owners were holding but not using. That land would be redistributed to landless peasants so they could feed their families, and the owners would be compensated. Here is the part that should make you laugh and then make you angry. The compensation was based on the value the owners themselves had declared for their land on their tax forms. For years, United Fruit had lied to the Guatemalan government about how much its land was worth, reporting it as nearly worthless so it could pay almost nothing in taxes. Now, Arbenz simply said, "Fine. If your land is worth as little as you told us, then that is what we'll pay you for it." The company was caught in its own deception. And it was furious. Not because the price was unfair, but because for the first time a government had refused to be afraid of it. This is the moment the story leaves the banana fields and enters something far more sinister. Because United Fruit did not respond by negotiating. It responded by launching one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in history. The company hired a man named Edward Bernays, often called the father of public relations, the pioneer who had figured out how to manufacture what the public thinks and feels. Bernays understood something crucial. To ordinary Americans, a land dispute in Guatemala meant nothing. But there was one word in 1950s America that could turn indifference into terror: communist. So that is the word Bernays reached for. He orchestrated a relentless campaign to convince the American public, press, and politicians that Guatemala was not a poor country trying to help its farmers. It was a Soviet beachhead in the Western Hemisphere, a communist dagger pointed at the United States. He arranged for journalists to be flown down on staged tours. He planted stories in respected newspapers. He fed the fear machine of the Cold War exactly what it craved. And he did it with such skill that a modest land reform came to look, in American eyes, like the opening move of a Soviet invasion. None of it was really true. Arbenz was no puppet of Moscow. He was a nationalist trying to drag his country into the modern world. But truth was never the point. The point was to change what a superpower believed, and then let that superpower do the company's dirty work for it. It worked terrifyingly well. In Washington, the story took hold, and here the tentacles reached higher than ever before, into the very top of the American government, into offices held by men with direct, personal ties to the fruit company, men who now had both the motive and the machinery to make a small country's elected leader disappear. The octopus had once pointed a finger and made a foreign army fire. Now it was about to point a finger and move the most powerful nation on earth. The men at the top of the American government were named Dulles, and they were brothers. John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State, the most powerful diplomat in the country. His brother, Allen Dulles, was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the man who ran America's spies. Together, These two brothers controlled both the public face of American foreign policy and its hidden hand. And both of them had deep, tangled ties to the fruit company. Their old law firm had done work for it. Its interests and their careers had been braided together for years. When the company whispered that Guatemala had become a communist threat, it was not whispering to strangers. It was whispering to friends who were already listening. So the decision was made, in the secret rooms where such decisions are made, to remove Arbenz from power. Not through diplomacy, not through the courts. Through a covert operation run by the CIA, given the codename PB Success. Here is what makes this operation so chilling. It was not, mostly, a war of soldiers. It was a war of illusion. The CIA understood that Arbenz commanded a real army and a legitimate government, and that a straightforward invasion would be bloody and obvious. So instead, they built a lie so convincing that it toppled a nation almost without firing on it. They assembled a small force of exiles under a hand-picked figurehead, a man the Americans could install and control. But the real weapon was radio. The CIA set up a clandestine station and broadcast into Guatemala, pretending to be rebel fighters reporting from the field. Day after day, they described a massive uprising sweeping the country, columns of rebel troops advancing, defections spreading, the government crumbling. Almost none of it was real. There was no great army bearing down on the capital. There were a few hundred men and a radio transmitter spinning a story. But the story worked. Panic spread. Rumors outran the truth. Nobody could tell what was actually happening, and in the fog, fear did the fighting. The CIA also flew planes over the capital, dropping leaflets and small bombs, not to conquer, but to terrify, to make it feel as if an unstoppable force had arrived. The person the illusion was really aimed at was Arbenz himself. Isolated, fed false reports, unsure who around him he could trust, watching the phantom rebellion grow in the minds of his own people, he made the calculation that broke him. He turned to his army and asked them to stand and fight. And his army, pressured, frightened, quietly worked on by the plotters, refused. That refusal was the end. With his own generals unwilling to defend him, Arbenz had nothing left. In the summer of 1954, he went on the radio himself, and in a bitter, defeated voice, he resigned. The elected leader of a sovereign nation was gone. Not beaten in battle, not voted out, but hollowed out by a story broadcast on a hidden frequency, backed by the two most powerful men in Washington, on behalf of a company that sold bananas. Let that settle for a moment. A fruit company, unhappy that a small country wanted to use its own idle land, had reached into the White House, activated the CIA, and overthrown a democratically elected government. The most powerful nation on earth had spent its intelligence service and its credibility to protect a corporation's profit margin. And it dressed the whole thing up as a heroic stand against communism, so that Americans would cheer it instead of question it. The man the Americans installed took power and immediately reversed the land reform, handing the fields back. The company had won. On paper, everything was fixed. The octopus was whole again, its tentacles firmly back in place. But a country is not a spreadsheet. You cannot murder a democracy in front of a whole population and expect them to simply move on. Something had been broken in Guatemala that would not heal. And the price for that single, tidy corporate victory would be paid, in blood, not for a year or a decade, but for the next 36. 36 years. That is how long the darkness lasted. The coup in 1954 did not bring stability, no matter what its architects claimed. It brought the opposite. By destroying Guatemala's young democracy, by teaching an entire nation that the ballot box meant nothing, that any leader who tried to help the poor would be crushed by forces beyond their borders, the operation ripped out the only peaceful path the country had. And when you close the peaceful path, people find other ones. What followed was a cascade of military dictatorships, each propped up by fear and by foreign backing. Any demand for the reforms Arbenz had once promised was now treated as subversion. The land stayed in the hands of the few, the poverty stayed, and the rage, with nowhere to go, hardened into armed resistance. By the 1960s, Guatemala had slid into a full civil war, a war that would grind on, in one form or another, for over 3 decades. But to call it a war is almost too clean a word, because it suggests two armies meeting on a field. What actually happened was something far more one-sided and far more monstrous. The state turned its weapons on its own people. Death squads roamed the country, dragging students, union organizers, teachers, priests, and peasants from their homes in the night. People simply vanished. So many that Guatemala gave the world a grim new phrase: the disappeared. Tens of thousands were taken and never seen again. Their bodies never returned, their families left to grieve without even a grave. And then came the worst of it. In the early 1980s, the violence reached a peak of horror that has a specific and terrible name: genocide. The military decided that the indigenous Maya people of the highlands were sympathetic to the rebels, and, rather than fight rebels, it chose to destroy communities. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Soldiers arrived and murdered everyone: men, women, the elderly, and children. They burned homes, slaughtered livestock, and salted the earth so survivors could never return. Hundreds of Maya villages were annihilated in a systematic campaign to erase a people. When it was finally over, when peace accords were at last signed in 1996, the accounting was staggering. Around 200,000 people were dead or disappeared. The overwhelming majority of them were not soldiers, they were civilians. And the vast majority of the atrocities were committed not by the rebels, but by the state. The very government structure that traced its origins back to the day a foreign company decided a reformer had to go. Now hold both ends of this story in your mind at once. At one end, a corporation is annoyed that a small country wants to tax it honestly and use its idle land. At the other end, 200,000 human beings are dead. An indigenous population has been targeted for extermination, and a nation is left shattered for generations. The line between those two ends is not a coincidence. It runs straight through a single decision made in secret rooms far away. A decision that treated an entire country as an obstacle to be removed from the path of profit. This is the true weight of the story. Not that a company was greedy. Companies are greedy. It is that the machinery of the most powerful nation on earth was quietly borrowed to serve that greed, and that the bill, a bill no executive ever saw, no shareholder ever paid, was handed to hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who never even knew the company's name. And that is what makes this history so uncomfortable to sit with, because the fruit did not stop. The demand did not stop. Long after Arbenz, long after the massacres, the same basic hunger kept driving the same basic machine. The names on the letterhead changed, the strategies grew subtler, the tentacles learned to hide. Which forces us to ask the question that this entire story has been building toward. The question that turns a piece of dusty history into something that should keep you up tonight. If a single, ordinary product on your kitchen counter could hide a crime this vast, this bloody, this deliberately buried, then what, exactly, are you holding in your hand right now? And what did it really cost? What you are holding in your hand is the most ordinary thing imaginable. That is the whole point. That is what should unsettle you. A banana costs almost nothing. It is so cheap, so constant, so unremarkable that we barely think of it as a product at all. It is just there, in every shop, every season, the same shape and the same price it was when we were children. And that impossible consistency, that boring reliability, is not natural. Nature does not deliver a perfect, uniform, always available fruit to the far side of the planet for pocket change. That took an empire. And that empire was built on everything you have just heard. So let's close the loop. The company that overthrew a government did not vanish. It was too poisoned by its own history to keep its old name. So it did what powerful things do when their reputation catches fire. It changed clothes. It rebranded. The octopus shed its skin and took a new, friendly, wholesome-sounding name, the kind of name you would happily read on a sticker without a flicker of suspicion. And under that clean, new label, the fruit kept flowing north, exactly as before. The crimes were folded into the past. The product stayed on the shelf. This is the deepest trick of the whole story, and it is worth naming plainly. A product is a mask. When something is cheap and everywhere and familiar, we stop asking how it got that way. We assume the low price is just the way the world is, when in truth someone, somewhere, paid the difference. In stolen land, in broken bodies, in silenced towns, in a democracy strangled in its cradle. The convenience on your counter is the visible tip. The cost is buried deliberately out of sight, in places whose names never make it onto the sticker. And here is the part that should stay with you longest. What happened with this one fruit was not a freak of history. It was a template. The same pattern, a raw material the world craves, a distant place with the land and the cheap labor to supply it, a powerful company that comes to control not just the trade, but the government, and a machine that is willing to spend human lives to keep prices low and profits high. That pattern has repeated again and again across the globe and across the centuries. Different products, different countries, the same shape. The sugar in your coffee, the tea in your cup, the spices in your kitchen, the cotton in your shirt, the rubber in your tires, the coffee that wakes you up. Each of them has its own version of this story. Each of them has a country somewhere behind it that was reshaped, sometimes shattered, to keep that thing cheap and endless and thoughtless on the other side of the world. Every ordinary object in your home is the end of a chain, and if you follow that chain back far enough, you will very often find a crime waiting at the other end, hidden not because it was small, but because we were never meant to look. That is not a reason to feel helpless. It is a reason to look. To understand that nothing that is cheap is actually free, that behind every effortless convenience is a history someone worked very hard to make you forget. The most radical thing you can do with a story like this is to refuse the forgetting, to hold the fruit, or the cup, or the shirt, and remember that it came from somewhere, and that somewhere had a price. Because the empire's real weapon was never the guns, or the ships, or even the men in Washington. Its real weapon was your ignorance. As long as the product looked innocent, the crime stayed invisible. The moment you see the crime inside the product, the spell breaks, and it can never quite be cast on you again. So the next time you pick up something so cheap and so ordinary that you don't even think about it, stop for 1 second and ask the only question that ever really mattered in this entire story. Not, what does this cost me? But what did it cost someone else? If this changed the way you'll look at the things in your own home, then follow along, because this is just one product, and there are so many more masks left to lift. Subscribe, and let's uncover the next one together.